morning. Great to see all of you here today. I have to say you seem like a very nice group. Not all golfers are kind and patient. I was golfing one time and had shot a 58 and another golfer came over and picked up my club and ball and said, "For Christ's sake, Randy, it's time to move on to the fourth hole." So I won't be in your way at the golf thing today. I'm currently an independent security analyst, which means I'm back in the job market, but for the past 6 years I worked at ESET, which is one of the products that's incorporated into OPSWAT, Metascan. I was the director of technical education there, and prior to that I worked at Microsoft for 12 years, and most of the time my job was to make sure that Microsoft didn't release infected software. So I have a very strong affinity to OPSWAT because I used a multi-scanner system and learned the same things that OPSWAT's learned along the way. And also a unique relationship with Norman. Kurt Nadvik was the originator and developer of the Northern Sandbox. And back in late 2000, he was getting really frustrated that he couldn't progress on his sandbox like he wanted to because he kept getting called into meetings. So he emailed me and said, "Randy, can I come out to Seattle for 6 weeks just so I can get away from these meetings?" And so he came out and stayed at a hotel near my house, and every morning I'd drive up and pick him up, and then we'd go to the park and ride, take the bus to Microsoft, and he'd work in my lab on his laptop on the sandbox, and I was there when he actually got the sandbox to recognize bugbear heuristically. So both companies that are hosting this today, I have a lot in common with. I was asked to talk a bit about the cybersecurity landscape today, and to me that can be somewhat of a boring subject. It's not that malware analysis is boring or any of that. It's saying the same stats and saying the same things over and over again gets a little dull. And I think the reason why we're saying the same things over and over again is because we're doing the same things over and over again. And like in a maze, when you don't know where you've come from, you keep going back through the same maze and channels again and again. It happens in real life too. I don't know if you remember, about a month ago, a family was trapped in a corn maze. We came in during the daytime, we got completely lost, and we have no idea where we are, the caller told the 911 operator. "I'm really scared, it's really dark, and we've got a 3-year-old baby with us." Aren't some of your users kind of like 3-year-old babies when it comes to technology? And aren't you really scared of what might happen on their desktop computers? Some things aren't quite so complicated, though. One of my favorite sayings of all times is, if you see only one solution, can anyone guess the rest of that? You probably don't understand the problem. And I try to keep that in the front of my mind, because when I'm trying to solve a problem and I only see a solution that I don't like, I try to remember to go back and look at the problem a bit differently to see if I can get some insight and other solutions might come to me. Much of the problem we're facing is social engineering. We have all kinds of amazing technologies, and the user is the weak link that allows things to get past. So I want to show you where we've come from. But to show you that, you have to understand how society historically has reacted to change and major changes. When cars entered our civilization, it began a dramatic change. It made transportation to much farther distances quite possible. Back in 1922, there were about 12.6 million cars in the world. 2010, a little over 1 billion. Basically, we had 88 years before we saw an 80-fold increase in automobiles. Now look at the internet. 1990, about 3 million users. 2010, 2.05 billion users. Almost 1 out of every 3 people on the planet is an internet user. How did, actually to show you another comparison, look at the difference in time we had to react to the change that a technology brought to our society. So how did we react to it with automobiles? We recognized that there was a problem. I took that picture at the Henry Ford Museum, actually. We recognized that there was a problem, and so we instituted things like school crossing guards. We taught traffic safety in school. When I was in elementary school, we had police come out, and they set up a little course with cones, and we had pedal cars, and we learned right turn and left turn, slow down. We were taught about traffic safety all through school. Driver's education in high school. And a testimony to the effectiveness of education is that insurance companies give discounts for completing driver's training courses. Insurance companies are not known for being magnanimous. In fact, throughout history, there have been certain skills that society deemed required for survival. At one time, every child, or at least every male child, depending on the culture, was taught to hunt, or fish, or fight. Clothes making was essential, especially in climates like up in the Pacific Northwest, where I hail from, where it gets pretty darn cold. Basket weaving. Where's the education to protect against social engineering? Social engineering has been with us throughout history. It's as old as civilization. However, in the past, it was very, very risky because typically the victim would see you. They could identify the perpetrator of the crime. Phone calls could be traced. So with the telephone, yeah, you could social engineer someone, but still, for the most part, you could trace a phone call. It was far too slow and expensive to send email except at a very specific target that might have high value. So social engineering was not generally scalable to mass attacks. And as a result, it wasn't a pervasive threat, so as a society, we didn't invest in education to teach people how to defend against social engineering attacks. It wasn't an expensive enough problem to put the resources into it. There were other things that had a better return for the money. The internet supercharged social engineering. With relative anonymity, there's virtually no risk of getting caught. The unseen victims reduce moral compunction. Where normally a person would feel sympathy and empathy when they looked at another person, that component of psychology is completely missing in internet-based attacks. It costs almost nothing to perform these attacks. It's very hard to prosecute because typically very low theft amounts mean prosecutors won't prosecute the crime. You know, if I steal 50 bucks from you on the internet, you can go to the police, but do you think they're going to investigate it? If I steal 50 bucks from 25,000 people, that's one heck of a payday. But each one lost 50 bucks. It's a low threshold. Even when they do try to prosecute it, there are international issues that hinder prosecution. So basically, this technology we call the internet became ubiquitous faster than society could react, and social engineering attacks have just exploded on the scene. It's actually a pretty bleak picture right now. Malware, espionage, identity theft attacks are all making extensive use of social engineering. These attacks are very costly and pervasive, which means it actually makes sense to invest in education. Unfortunately, the reality of today is that social engineering defense is not part of our social education. It's become a massive problem for society, and yet we haven't applied the same principles from roads we've been down in the past with different technologies, different influences on society to combat the problem, how we've got years and years and years of history showing it's an effective approach. It costs virtually nothing to perform these attacks. You know, somebody in a third world country can sit at an internet cafe and attack 500,000 people scattered all over the world. I came across this little gem actually on Facebook. It was posted on someone's wall. We cannot solve our problems with the same thinking we used when we created them. How have we been trying to solve social engineering problems? Well, we use anti-phishing technology because a lot of spam, a lot of social engineering attacks look just like spam. And that's effective to some degree in reducing some of the shots on goal. Anti-spam also, what I meant to say first, anti-phishing, the phishing attacks can be fingerprinted to an extent. Anti-spam, more technology. Access control, that's really admitting defeat and saying, okay, we're going to mitigate the damage by restricting what parts of the network a user who gets compromised has access to. And it makes a lot of sense, but it doesn't stop the attacks. Graphical user interfaces. I refer to these as the anti-education technology. When I got my first computer, I waited a full year to put Windows on it because I didn't want pictures doing stuff for me that I didn't understand what they were doing. But thanks to Microsoft and Apple, computers have become so simple to use that a user never has to learn anything about them. And actually having a fundamental understanding of how the computers work, what they can do and can't do, and a knowledge that computers lie to you all the time, is a very effective component in identifying social engineering attacks. And we've had gibberish, poor attempts at education, like don't open suspicious emails. All of you work in technology, right? All of you have a relative that doesn't work in technology, right? Does suspicious mean the same thing to you that it means to them? Like, what do you mean that was suspicious? It came from my mom. Well, no, it looked like it came from your mom. It didn't actually come from your mom. So we need to do a much better job at education. And a lot of people have had an aversion to investing in education. What if we train our employees and they leave? Noted leadership consultant Mark Sanborn replies to that, what if we don't and they stay? Well, of course, we all know the answer to that. This is a 2005 article from eWeek. Spear phishing attack targets credit unions. And it was a wave of spear phishing attacks to attack CEOs of credit unions, presumably to be able to compromise a lot of accounts instead of just attacking one small account. 2008, large prey are targets of phishing. Again, phishing attacks, I'm not exactly sure how they tricked these people into believing they were getting an official subpoena, but engineers, social engineers are pretty tricky sometimes. Again, executive level, but it's not just executive level. In this case, a creep decided to purchase a spyware package and sent it to his ex-girlfriend so he could spy on her. He didn't realize that she was going to open her Yahoo email on a hospital computer. It infected the computer. It gave access to confidential patient records. I know some of you work in healthcare, and it's got to be a pretty scary thing to see. It was a regulatory nightmare for the hospital, and the idiot, due to his choice of targets, ended up getting apprehended because a hospital is a big enough and important enough institution for law enforcement to respond to. But this shows what the uneducated end user can allow into the network. It isn't just the CEO level people that can compromise the network. 2011, April 20th, Oak Ridge National Laboratories shut off their internet for a while because they discovered that they had been spearphished. And one of the encouraging things about this is only a few megabytes of data were stolen before the lab disconnected, which means that they're getting intrusion detection down pretty good and response. However, there was an employee that still fell for a spear phishing attack. Epsilon sends billions of emails a year, and they fell victim to a spear phishing attack. And another company they worked with had warned them that it was coming too. So what if we don't train our employees and they stay? Yeah, this is what happens. So the state of the union. We're at least 2 generations away from pervasive netizen education. What I mean by that is where it's societal knowledge that social engineering attacks happen and a variety of ways that they happen and how to identify these things. And the reason we're 2 generations away is, for one, to date, our attempts have been pretty ineffective. We're going to have a generation of teachers that are educated and have effective teaching tools and techniques to teach the next generation of students to grow up with this kind of thinking in their consciousness. And when that generation becomes teachers, they'll be good enough at it that we can see a decline in the threat of social engineering. It's not ever going to go away. For this to work, the curriculum's got to start at 1st grade at the latest, and it has to continue through high school. How many of you had fire drills in school? How many of you only have 1 fire drill? I'll bet you had multiple fire drills a year. I was fortunate enough to be at the ESET headquarters on the 20th floor when we had a fire drill, and I had to go down 20 floors of stairs. Fire drills happen over and over because they realize that some things are important enough that you have to keep awareness and knowledge there. So we've got to keep education going. It has to continue through at least high school. And we have to have some focused training on social engineering attacks. I'm all for teaching general computer education, general computer security. We need to have secure coding taught when we start teaching people how to code. But we really need a lot of focus on social engineering attacks. However, your cybersecurity can't wait 2 generations. You've got to have something now. Technology does help mitigate risk, and heuristics and automation are essential. And one of the things I talked about having the right education, I know how to teach anyone at your company, whether it's a janitor or CEO, what heuristics are. Give them a functional understanding of what heuristics are, and make it interesting to them. Is understanding heuristics going to help them protect against social engineering attacks? No, but it's going to teach them that they can learn the technology, and that's part of the barrier of education, is getting people to see that, yeah, I can actually understand this, and there are parts of it that are interesting. Heuristics are how you get away from static signatures in the antivirus world. Heuristics are used in intrusion prevention, intrusion detection. You take a look at a variety of factors and you decide if something is bad based upon its behaviors or a set of rules about attributes concerning the object that you're looking for. In today's world, with the massive amounts of information coming at us, the massive numbers of files that we see, you're going to have some automation around the heuristics because you can't look at everything. So we use heuristics to make some sense out of random information. We're able to weed out the stuff that we don't want. Any of you ever seen a dog and you didn't know what breed it was, but you knew it was a dog, right? That's your mind using heuristics. You knew it wasn't a cat, you weeded that out, it wasn't a giraffe or a donkey or a plant. Well, that's what heuristics does with the data that we're trying to find that might be malicious. It rules out a whole bunch of harmless stuff that you don't need to see. If you had to look at every file and every system call and every DLL it uses, you'd never get anything done. The automation is what makes a timely response possible. So OPSWAT Metascan is one of the technologies that I recommend that you look into when you're trying to keep up with what's happening, because we're not going to get ahead until we've got the education component. But today you've got technological tools. One of the beautiful things about Metascan is that you maximize heuristic approaches. You know, like Norman and ESET and McAfee and Symantec, they don't just have this little package called heuristics that they plug in. They have scientists that are very, very bright people that are coming up with their own rules and their own weights for these rules. And they approach heuristics somewhat differently. There's different ways of looking at things. People have different ideas. It's a lot like art. There are tons of very, very talented artists, and they produce beautiful but different works of art. So by running multiple antivirus scanners, you're able to take advantage of multiple heuristic approaches. And that's what was the most important thing to me at Microsoft, why I had 11 different scanners. I didn't need 11 different scanners for signatures. If I just wanted signatures, probably 4 or 5 would have been more than enough. I wanted every heuristic approach possible to help me spot something bad coming through. Metascan is really, really good for outgoing QA and security. It was just about a year ago, a little over a year ago, I was at OPSWAT in Australia. And I'm bummed to this day that I didn't stop by the IBM booth because they were handing out thumb drives with malware on it. I didn't get my free sample. If they would have taken one of those thumb drives when they got them back from the third-party vendor that made them for them and stuck them in a machine running OPSWAT Metascan, and OPSWAT has a product specifically for removable media, they would have caught it. This is a really simple step, but it can really save your bacon, because if you send something out infected to a customer or a media relation, it's not a good thing. And believe me, my job was making sure that Microsoft didn't release infected software. And I told Microsoft when they tasked me with this that they'd be lucky if they went 5 years doing everything I said, if they went 5 years without an incident. It's about 5.5 years later, one got passed. And it was so deeply embedded in the compiled help file that nobody ever got infected by it accidentally. But it sure didn't look good in the press. It's also good for incoming quality control and security. When you get materials back from a vendor, when you get materials from another vendor, even from an IBM, you want to scan it and make sure that before it hits your network, it's safe to use. And I'll tell you what, yes, you can build your own multi-scanner system. I've actually written a controller for a multi-scanner system in batch file. It's a lot of work, and there are amazing pitfalls. You run into problems like one scanner can't open a file because another scanner's got it open, and figuring out what the right combination is, because if you do them one at a time, it just takes forever. So it's a really, really powerful tool for you. You can avoid some false positive pitfalls too. You might be using one product. You're probably only using one product on your company desktop. You might have a company that uses one on the desktop and a different vendor's product on email or the firewall or something like that. But if you're sending something out to another customer, another client, the media, you don't necessarily know what antivirus product they're using. By using a multi-scanner system, you can know if an antivirus product is false positiving on your file. Because I'll tell you what, when the outside party scanner comes up and says it's infected, the first thing they do is say, you sent me an infected file. And they tell their friends that you sent them an infected file. And then when they find out that it wasn't infected, the antivirus company had a false positive, they're a little humiliated that they accused you of doing that. They're really angry at the antivirus company, and they forget to tell your friends that, no, actually you didn't send them something effective. So using a multi-scanner system can save you a lot of heartache in the false positive department. It also can take a lot of work sometimes in the false positive department when you're scanning 5 terabytes of data a month with 11 different scanners, all set on maximum paranoid mode. You can also get to know the nature of the beast. For example, if you're scanning and the Northern Sandbox heuristically flags a file, it'll give you a little information, but other programs might have signatures for it. And that can give you a lot more information about, is this a backdoor program? Is it a specific type of bot, a specific type of Trojan password stealer? Is it looking for gaming credentials, or is it looking for network credentials? Things like that. So you can learn a lot more about the nature of the beast by using multiple scanners. And finally, confidential means confidential. You don't have to send your personal, private, confidential files out to something like VirusTotal to figure out if it's clean or not. You can keep your data inside your network, and especially in things like healthcare, that's one of the financial services. That data's got to stay inside. You really can't be sending it out over the net. Yes, you can build your own multi-scanner system, and believe me, it's really, really hard work to do alone. So tell me, why are these cars going so slow? Does a Ferrari not have a powerful engine? It's the environment that it's in. And I use this to lead into the Northern Sandbox. The Norman malware analyzer, which is a sandbox, was first born as part of the virus scanning engine. This is a really, really powerful tool that was throttled by the antivirus engine, and for good reason. You're scanning all kinds of stuff on multiple desktops. You have to be very conservative so that you don't have a lot of false positives. So despite the wealth of information that the sandbox gleaned about the nature of a file it might be investigating, it had to use rules that were optimized to prevent false positives. Like, you remove the sandbox, the malware analyzer, from the scanning engine, and you give it to a human being who's able to look at all of the data. They can use their mind, the dynamic human heuristic. With the automation and heuristics that the sandbox has provided, you've narrowed down the scope of what you have to look at, and now you're looking at the important stuff, and you're getting all the information. What ports is this calling out to? What registry settings is this changing? What DLLs is it calling? All this wonderful information that can help you identify the nature of the potential threat, help you say, no, that's not actually a threat at all, it's meant to do that. One of the early false positives I had was the Northern Sandbox. This was pre-released, I was helping train it. Microsoft timeserver.exe, I was scanning that, and it came back and said, possible backdoor, listening on port such and such. Well, a time server is actually supposed to listen on a port, and Kurt got that fixed. But, when it's not inside of a virus scanner, that's not a false positive, that's information that this application is listening on this port. So you can use that information to help determine, are you looking at something good or something bad. Appropriate automation. So you've automated the task of reverse engineering the file fundamentally. And now all that's left is the human heuristic of saying, okay, this makes sense, that doesn't make sense, that's really, really bad. You can use that information to determine where it might have gone on the network as well. In one respect, you're also creating a knowledge base automatically and simultaneously, because the sandbox logs a ton of information about the files that you scan and the natures of the different threats, and you can search for that. So technology is really important. I'm a huge advocate of education, as Nick from Facebook can testify to, but education alone doesn't do it, and neither does technology. You also need policy. Policy is an important part of defending against threats. However, oftentimes education is required to even understand policy. One of my favorite pastimes when I travel is to go to the Hotel Business Center computer and see what I can find there. And how many of you have a policy that you don't share confidential information? I mean, we all do. How many of your employees understand that when they go to work on that Word document on the Hotel Business Center computer, a temporary copy was left behind? I found actually a couple spreadsheets for a major medical supply company. This was back east at a hotel I stayed at. The spreadsheets had sales teams in the region, who the sales leaders were, the numbers for each of the salespeople, the gross for the team. If I wanted to sell a competitor some really good information, I could tell them who the top performing salespeople in the company were. They didn't understand that opening that file on the hotel business computer was violating policy. They didn't want to violate policy, but they didn't have the education required to understand policy. Education actually increases the efficacy of security products. Your educated IT guy can do wonderful things with Metascan, with the malware analyzer. Your average user can understand what their virus scanner just told them with education. Often they don't even understand that today. So defense in depth does require multiple layers of technology, policy, and education. Crime is a social problem that's been with us throughout history. We've never eliminated crime. Technology, however, rarely if ever solves a social problem. So until society catches up and gets ahead of the curve on education and integrating computer security into our sociological profile, our composition, you're going to have to use technology. Do you have the tools you need? I'm not going to say any more about OPSWAT or the Sandbox or other speakers that will go into more detail on that. But I think they're very interesting tools to look at. That, I thank you very much. If there are any questions, I'm delighted to at least attempt to answer them. Well, I hope you got some insight into everything.
So, Randy, maybe you could speak a little bit more about your experience at Microsoft too. You said that you predicted that at best you could go Microsoft would go 5 years without releasing a malware sample. Could you give a little more detail about how many samples Microsoft, or I guess software releases, Microsoft was producing on a daily or periodic basis, and what was your infrastructure to, I guess, effectively create this outbound QA for Microsoft?
Well, this actually started in 1997. Microsoft released 2 infected products to the People's Republic of China. And the way I heard the story was China said, look, Microsoft, we think maybe you're doing this to favor Taiwan. If it ever happens again, you'll never sell another product in China. To which I said, well, how important is it to sell a second product in China? Management failed to see the humor in that, and completely having no idea what he was talking about, the Vice President of Operations promised Bill Gates and Steve Ballmer that operations would make sure it never happened again, and I was the only one they knew in the entire operations chain that knew anything about antivirus software, so it got dropped in my lap. And I started with 3 Pentium 2 computers, each running 4 different antivirus products. At that stage, we were, I mean, it would vary from day to day, but usually 1 to 4 products a day would release. And this was, at that time, just Microsoft retail software. Later on down the line, OEM got incorporated into it, and we added more machines. And then as marketing would release stuff that was infected, they were mandated to go through my systems as well as, there was one incident where product support services released an infected update. Now, you had to pay a lot of money to get that virus. It wasn't free. You had to have a Premier Support account that cost buku bucks. So only our best customers got that software, but then product support services couldn't release a patch without sending it through my systems. I also simultaneously opened up the systems to the whole company. Now, the product groups were supposed to do their own virus scanning before they submit the product for release, which makes sense. So I had our form created, which we had a paper form for a long time. It said, list the 2 products that you use to scan this software in the version, last update. And well, I got a lot of kickback from some groups saying, but there's only one site licensed product. It's like, that's right. To do your job, you need another product. Or in some cases, the products were woefully out of date. So I started something called the virus checking service inside of Microsoft, and anyone could submit files to that for scanning. By the time I left that position at Microsoft, I was scanning about 5 terabytes of data a month. This included any retail releases in every language that Microsoft released in. This included all the OEM software. This included electronic distribution software. This included marketing, product support services, virtually everything that Microsoft released. And so that was about 4 or 5 terabytes of data every month. And I had about 50 machines. Now this was back in, it was at the end of 2004. I changed positions. I went to a different job at Microsoft that worked with very large ISPs. I believe today Microsoft has about 500 machines, and it's probably running closer to 13 or 14 different antivirus products.